I would like to take a moment to honor the memory of Dr. Vladimir Vařinek, in whose name we have gathered here today. The subject I am about to present was, in fact, one of the last topics I had the privilege of discussing with him during visits at his home. And I really deeply regret that he cannot see the final version of the paper, as I would have greatly valued his insights and reflections. Now, let me turn to the main subject of the presentation. I will focus on a passage from Procopius, specifically chapter 38 in the 7th book of the Wars. This text is relatively well known and frequently cited in discussions of early Slavic history. Procopius provides a detailed account of events around the year 550, when an army of Sclavenes invaded Thrace. The narrative begins much like other accounts of Sclavene raids. A large force crossed the Danube and began to plunder the whole region. The text contains striking descriptions of cruelty directed both at individuals and at larger groups. It includes an account of the conquest of the city Toperos, and concludes with reports of brutal executions of captives, along with the enslavement of thousands of prisoners by bloodthirsty Slavs. At first sight, this might seem like just another passage on barbarian violence. Yet the unusual, explicit, and detailed depiction of brutality has inspired a wide range of interpretations. In earlier scholarship, this episode was often read as evidence of intensified Slavic penetration of the Balkans around the year 550. Some scholars stressed its extraordinary description of cruelty, while others consider it part of a literary topos, one of the conventional ways of negative portraying barbarian enemies, comparable to depictions of other invaders of the Roman Empire. There is also the view that Procopius may have exaggerated these atrocities as a subtle critic of Emperor Justinian. However, there are also opinions suggesting that the description of atrocities might have been based on reality. The depictions of mass killings and executions have been also interpreted by some as reflecting a pagan background. For example, Piotr Shumalov interpreted the violence as a manifestation of a primordial warrior cult among the early Slavs, and Eugenio Lujan has interpreted the brutal slaughter of prisoners in this year as ritual pagan sacrifice. I'd like to highlight that in the Czech scholarly tradition, this passage also drew attention of scholars. For instance, Lubor Nidela, the first head of our institute in the 1920s, was struck by its exceptional cruelty, interpreting it through the romantic lens of his time. He suggested that the Slavs were essentially peaceful, yet compelled to violence as others were too violent, and this violence further intervened with their pagan background. However, we may have some serious doubts about this view today. Nevertheless, I find it an interesting testimony to how already Nederland perceived this text as an unusual and felt compelled to explain it even more than 100 years ago. More recently, for example, a historian who also was member of the Czech Academy of Sciences, Dušan Třeštík, proposed in 1997 that the violence described by Procopius in this chapter was in fact an indirect evidence on a deliberate tactic coordinated with other barbarian groups, particularly the Gepids, with the purpose to frighten Byzantines and to stretch their forces across multiple fronts. So, when I came across this text, and consider the range of modern interpretations and approaches, I began to wonder, is this chapter truly as exceptional as some scholars believe? Or is it simply a random and ordinary description of barbarian cruelty, as some others proposed? Does it really depart from Procopius' usual style? Or can we find striking similarities elsewhere in his other works, or even in contemporary texts by other authors? To explore this, I compared the chapter with other sections of Procopius, looking closely at both the narrative details and the language he used, while also I searched for parallels in other sources. So let us now turn directly to the chapter itself. The chapter opens with the statement that an army of Sclavenes, numbering no more than 3,000, crossed the Danube and then divided into two contingents, the larger of which comprised 1,800 men. This is in fact the only instance in which Procopius provides specific numerical data concerning the Sclavenes. In his other accounts of their invasions, he confines himself to vague expressions such as the nations, a great throng, or similar phrases denoting large numbers, but never specifies an exact figure. This was the first thing that caught my attention when reading this chapter. Equally noteworthy is the terminology Procopius uses here to denote the Sclavian force. In this particular chapter, he employs three terms: stratevma, stratos, and stratoperum. All of these terms carry the connotation of an organized army, which stands in contrast to most earlier descriptions of Sclavian raids in his texts, where we hear mainly, but not exclusively, just about hordes. The term stratevma occurs once more in the same book shortly before this chapter, in connection with an earlier invasion dated to circa 548, which in reality marks the beginning of the wave of invasions to which the one in 550 also belong. And the terms stratos and stratoperum, however, appear here for the first time in reference to the Sclavenes. Apart from these occurrences, the two terms are found only once again in connection with these Sclavenes. In chapter 40 of the same book, where it refers to the events later in the same year. This means a continuation of this big wave of inroads. According to Procopius, the period around 550 witnessed an intensification of Sclavian incursions. At one point in this chapter, Procopius even remarks that it appears that they have never crossed the Danube river with an army before this occasion that I have here mentioned. Of course, he had already recorded earlier Sclavian raids, but it is reasonable to assume that what is meant here is the first instance of such a large-scale and organized incursion. The narrative further states that the Sclavenes encountered little resistance during their advance and crossed the river and invaded without any effort, using the term pono udeni. Expressions of this kind are common in Procopius' works in the context of barbarian raids. Yet, in the case of Sclavenes, it appears only in this chapter, only in this place. So the motive of barbarians capturing fortresses or cities with no effort, employing the same or similar vocabulary, recurs across Procopius' writings in both critical and laudatory context concerning the Justinian policy towards barbarians. We can find examples in both the secret history and their edifices, but never, as I said, in context of the Sclavenes. The account then continues with the information that the Byzantine army clashed with the Sclavenes in both Illyricum and Thrace, and in each case the Byzantines were defeated. What Procopius describes is essentially a sudden and unexpected attack, during which part of the Byzantine troops were killed, while the rest fled in complete disorder. This motive of the unexpected assault is particularly significant. It recurs not only in Procopius' descriptions of various barbarians' attacks and even of Byzantine forces themselves, but also in later sources on the Sclavenes, for example, in Strategikon of Morris. One of the central motives at the beginning of this chapter is the capture of Asbarius, a cavalry commander in Thrace based in Zurlon, modern Chorlu, whom Procopius refers to as an imperial spearman. that is, a member of the Imperial Guard. Asbatos was captured somewhere in Thrace, tortured, and killed by the Sclavens. According to Procopius, after seizing him, they cut strips of skin from his back and then burned him alive. This account is striking, for Procopius rarely records cases in which barbarian groups captured a Byzantine general or a commander, subjected him to torture, and described in detail the manner of his death. Elsewhere in his work, such incidents are mentioned only briefly, and mainly in connection with the Goths, where he provides little or no information about how actually the commanders were killed, just that they were brutally killed by the barbarians. In the case of Asbatos, however, Procopius is unusually explicit. He employs the verb egdero, which means to flay or to strip the skin off, which otherwise appears in his work only once, when describing the fate of a certain Vassak who was flayed alive by a Persian king, and it was a form of very strict punishment. Procopius records such an act only in these two instances. From other ancient sources, we know that flying was considered one of the most severe forms of punishment in Persian and Egyptian traditions, often inflicted for crimes against a ruler. At the same time, the motive of flying appears particularly in descriptions of extreme cruelty among so-called savage tribes, like Scythians or related peoples inhabiting regions near Scythia, as well as other nomads, who were said to trade their prisoners in this manner. We can find such parallels also in Herodotus or Ammianus Marcellius and others. A parallel can also be found in the Byzantine encyclopedic source Suda, which recounts similar atrocities inflicted on Roman inhabitants by Hasdrubal. And Suda explicitly presents these deeds as horrifying and meant to shock the population. So Procopius continues by noting that the Sclavens persisted in their plundering, capturing fortresses, and devastating the cities of Thrace and Illyria. He provides a particularly detailed description of the capture of Toperos. This marks a new development in his narrative. Until then, he had primarily reported raids across the Danube involving looting, killing, and taking captives. The mention of a siege and the conquest of Toperos is significant, as it is the only city explicitly named by Procopius as having fallen to the Sclavens. A comparable report appears once in year, in 548, when these big raids started, when he observes that the Sclavens had taken several undefended strongholds, but he did not refer them by name. Prior to the siege of Toperos, Procopius generally employed the terms Choria and Fruria, designating settlements and fortified places that were captured by the Sclavens during the earlier inroads. In the case of Toperos, however, he uses the term polis. Equally striking is the detail with which Procopius describes its capture. He says how the Sclavens employed an ambush, a feigned attack and retreat lured the Roman troops out of the gate, only for them to be encircled and killed by hidden enemies. With the garrison destroyed, the city fell by storm. Ambushes and sudden attacks recur in accounts of Slavic and Ante warfare, and are later mentioned also in other sources, for example, again in the Strategicon. Furthermore, this is the earliest attested instance in which any siege instrument is mentioned in connection with the Sclavens. It's the ladder, or climax. While hardly exceptional in itself, ladders were often mentioned in context of various battles, in context with other enemies. This is the only explicit reference to siege equipment in the 6th century sources in connection with the Slavs. More complex machinery appears only later in the 7th century sources, as for example in the Miracula Sancti Demetrii. Afterwards, Procopius recounts slaughter and plunder, with women and children enslaved, a common motive in his descriptions of barbarians' incursions in general. Particularly vivid is his image that Illyria and Thrace were everywhere filled with unburied corpses. He uses similar imagery again in the 8th book of the Wars. in the context of another Sclavene's inroad in 552, and in the secret history where he laments that barbarians had turned the land into a Scythian wilderness, and all literary topos expressing like barbarian ferocity. The narrative then shifts to the methods of killing employed by the Sclavenes on the numerous people they had captured, which Procopius explicitly notes as unusual. The first method described by him is impalement. Also, Procopius elsewhere refers to impalement with the word anascorpizo in his works. In context involving Persians, Goths, and Romans themselves, here in this chapter, in context with the Sclavenes, he avoids this word. Instead, he offers a uniquely explicit, vivid description. Why he chose this way of description remains uncertain, so it produced an exceptionally vivid effect. In all other instances, impalement in Procopius' general involved only one or two individuals deemed guilty of a particular grave offenses. Here, it's the only time when it's used like against bigger number of people. So I try to search for parallels, but detailed depictions of impalement are actually rare. A rather close parallel is Cassius Dio's account of the Britons' ritual killing of captured Roman women. In ancient and Byzantine sources, the verb anascolpizo is also at times used for crucifixion. For example, here on the slide, you can see example from Eusebius, who used the verb for the death of Apostle Peter, who in accordance to the biblical tradition was actually crucified. And in De Morte Peregrini, the word was used to describe the crucifixion of Christ. This raises the question of whether, in those other passages where Procopius employs anascolpizo, he invariably meant literal impalement, as it has been traditionally translated, or whether, in the case of the Sclavenes, he consciously chose a more vivid and explicit description, precisely because he had elsewhere used the verb anascolpizo in other sense. This poses a complication for interpretation, because if Procopius used the verb anascolpizo in the sense of impalement in other instances in his work, then the unusually detailed description of the practice in the case of the Sclavenes might indicate either an intention to evoke more horrifying impression, or perhaps it's a kind of evidence on reliance on an oral source which provided such vivid details. So it's difficult to say. Two further methods of killing are described: captives beaten to death with clubs using the term Pavla, the only instance in Procopius where actually this term is used, or burned alive in huts along with livestock that could not be driven away. While these practices are shocking for readers, they are not entirely without precedent. Elsewhere, Procopius depicts similar violence as arising from the chaos of battle. However, these are different situations rather than as deliberate acts targeting regular prisoners or the local population. What is particularly noteworthy in Procopius is his claim that the barbarians prefer to kill prisoners whom they could not carry off as spoils. Theophylact Simocata and Marcellinus Gomez report similar instances. Theophylact noting that barbarians would execute their captives when confronted by an approaching Roman army, and Marcellinus reporting that this occurred when the ransom offered was insufficient in the eyes of barbarians. In the case of Theophylact, this again concerns the Sclavenes, whereas Marcellinus refers to the Gothic cavalry. Also, some scholars argue that Sclavenes may have been included as well. Moving into a later period, Leo Diaconus offers a striking statement in the 10th century regarding the Rus, noting that they slaughtered a large number of captives, both men and women, in accordance with what he calls the ancestral custom. So the account concludes with the image that, as if drunk with the blood they had shed, the Sclavenes carried off a large number of captives. The taking of captives is a recurring motive in Procopius, but the metaphor of drunkenness with blood is not really so common in his work. The only comparable bloodthirsty figure in his writing is actually Justinian in the Secret History, so described in different terms and cannot be really compared to Sclavene's. And the imagery also recalls biblical texts in which drunkenness with blood signifies a kind of divine vengeance or apocalyptic destruction. Such biblical motifs and analogies are again frequently found in Byzantine texts describing barbarian attacks in general. More broadly, the topos of cruelty and bloodlust is a staple of late antique ethnographic writing applied to many barbarian groups, ranging from Avars and Goths to Huns, Saracens, Latins, and Rus. So, if we ask whether this chapter stands out for its depiction of brutality, the answer depends on the perspective. When placed within the broader tradition of writing about barbarians and enemies, it follows well-established conventions. Cruelty is emphasized, certain motives evoke the long-standing topos of extreme Scythian savagery. This aligns with common portrayal of Sclavens and other barbarian groups in late antique and Byzantine sources. The description of their tactics in capturing the city of Toperos also aligns with what is known from another source, more strategical noise. Regardless of whether the events themselves occurred exactly as described, the episode reflects a literary motive deeply rooted in classical representations of savagery, most often associated with the Scythians and other nomadic peoples. In this way, Procopius' account conforms to the broader Byzantine tendency to situate the Sclavenes within the traditional framework of barbarism. What distinguishes this chapter, however, is the level of detail and the almost naturalistic vividness with which Procopius conveys these acts. For example, the impalement of victims or their beating tied to stakes and beaten to death with clubs. The unusual graphic depictions make this chapter exceptional, providing one of the most detailed surviving accounts of a specific Slavic invasion in the 6th century sources. It is important to stress that the 6th century context in other sources dated to this century, we learn actually little about the specific actions of Slavic invaders toward people in the invaded lands, beyond brief statements that they killed or enslaved many. Moreover, the invasion described by Procopius predates by several decades the later Slavic sieges of Thessaloniki in the late 6th century, and by more than 70 years the famous siege of Constantinople in 626 by Sassanids, Avars, and the Slavs, both events vividly narrated in the 7th century sources. The character of the chapter 38, however, contrasts with chapter 14 of the same book, which presents the well-known ethnographic excursus on the Sclavenes and the Ante, portraying them as relatively harmless and simple, familiar only with basic weapons such as spears, which you can see here on the slide. Yet even this paradox fits into the broader literary tradition. From Tacitus onward, descriptions of barbarians often oscillated between idealization and vilification of barbarians. Moreover, it is highly probable that the excursus on the Sclavenes and Ante was composed before the large waves of Slavic invasion that began after 548. In my view, the reasons why this chapter diverges in some respects from Procopius' usual treatment of the Sclavenes and other barbarians must lie in its chronology. The first 7 books of wars were likely circulated around mid-551. It is a general opinion of scholars, meaning the events of 550 described in the chapter 38 were extremely fresh in Procopius' mind, likely reported in Constantinople by eyewitnesses, by survivors from Thrace. We are dealing with a major invasion in which Procopius depicts not only a merely barbarian horde or group, but a regular army. For the Procopius view, it was for the first time the Sclavens succeeded in organizing a coordinated force and in seizing a fortified city, Toperos, a place which, as Procopius records in his other work on buildings, had to have its fortifications rebuilt by Justinian after this particular attack. Considering the position of Toperus, the nearby city of Zurlon, the military base to the ill-fated commander Asparus, and the proximity to Constantinople itself, where Procopius lived at the time, and where his books were being circulated just the next year after the attack, it seems plausible that the vivid and at times quite realistic inscriptions reflect both a sense of immediacy and the shock of a large-scale, unexpected assault. This attack appeared far more intense than earlier raids he described, coming from a people who, just a few chapters earlier, were still portrayed by him as relatively simple and unfamiliar. And I would like to conclude with Geoffrey Greitrich's remark on barbarians in Procopius' work. The newest barbarian, one might say, was always the most dangerous. And I believe it is precisely this perception that explains why chapter 38 in the 7th book is written by Procopius as it is. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pavla. I would like to ask a question. Thank you very much. I have just a very simple question. Are there any descriptions of the physical appearance of Sclavene? And if so, how does Procopius?
Yes, actually, in this excursus of Procopius, there's also a sentence mentioning that the Sclavenes were tall, that their hair was like reddish, and they were not so white, but also not so dark. So, and in general, the idea which it conveys is that they were like big and
yes, yeah, thank you. It's one somehow perhaps expect because like a typical barbarian in Greek literature is often a dark skin, which probably could not be applied for the Slavs
actually
or Sclavenes, and also the like blonde hair is like an attribute of beauty, so the red is a good compromise.
No,
thank you.
Because actually at some point he gives a very similar statement on the way how the gods look like, and he uses more or less the same sentence with the change that gods are blonde.
Okay.
Yeah.
More questions?
Can I just pick up your last words about Goths? Because I wonder what the comparison with the Goths is. Are you saying that really there is no comparison to this brutal description of the Slavs in his description of the Goths war, their behavior?
It's interesting. I haven't found any similar text. I mean, there are sentences where he says, "Oh, gods created cruelly the prisoners," but he doesn't say how. He doesn't. Yeah, this is what really seems to me strange. Is actually the amount of the text he gives to the description of some of the executions. Yeah. Of course, gods are also described as quite cruel and brutal barbarians, but he never gives too many details. And I think that the reason might be that actually gods are quite well known, and he can focus on more detailed things like diplomacy and so on.